My brother betrayed me and got my wife pregnant, but now I'm raising their son. Here's how I found peace after the ultimate betrayal. Family isn't something you choose, but it's something you're expected to protect, cherish, and forgive, no matter what. At least, that's what I'd always been told. Growing up, I believed in that unbreakable bond between family members, that no matter how much we disagreed or argued, we'd always have each other's backs. But some betrayals cut so deep, they sever the ties you thought were indestructible. My name is Ethan, and this is the story of how my brother, David, took everything from me, my trust, my family, my marriage, and how our parents played a role in shaping the downfall of our once unbreakable family. David and I were 2 years apart, but we couldn't have been more different. He was the golden boy, charming and outgoing, while I was more reserved, studious, and focused. From the moment David was born, our parents, Joan and Robert, treated him like he was something special. Maybe it was because he was their second child, and they felt more confident in their parenting skills, or maybe it was just his natural charisma. Whatever the reason, they doted on him like he was the center of their universe. I didn't resent it at first. As a kid, I was quiet and happy enough to stay in the background. I didn't need the spotlight. But as I got older, it became clear that our parents had different expectations for us. I was expected to work hard, get good grades, and be the responsible one, while David was free to float through life, charming his way out of trouble whenever he got into it. And he did get into trouble, constantly. David was the kind of person who could talk his way out of anything. If he missed a school project, he'd convince the teacher to give him an extension. If he crashed the family car, he'd charm our parents into letting him off the hook without punishment. It became a pattern. David would make mistakes, and I would be the one left cleaning up after him, both figuratively and sometimes literally. One particular incident from our teenage years still stands out. David had borrowed my car without asking, something that had become increasingly common as he got older. He took it for a joyride one night, racing through town with his friends. I was out studying late, and by the time I came home, the car had a massive dent in the fender. David had hit something, a post or a curb, I'm not sure, but the damage was clear. When I confronted him, he flashed that disarming smile of his and said, "Come on, man, it's not a big deal. I'll fix it. Just don't tell mom and dad." I should have been furious. I should have told him to take responsibility. But years of being the good son had conditioned me to cover for him, to protect him from the consequences of his actions. I ended up paying for the repairs myself, using money I had saved from a part-time job. David never repaid me, and our parents never found out. That incident was just one of many, but it set the tone for the rest of our relationship. David would mess up, and I'd be the one left to pick up the pieces. After high school, David's path became even more erratic. He tried his hand at a few community college courses but quickly dropped out. He bounced from one low-paying job to another, never staying in one place for too long. Meanwhile, I went to a good college, graduated with a degree in business, and started building a future for myself. That's where I met Jessica, the woman who would eventually become my wife. Jessica was everything I could have hoped for in a partner: intelligent, ambitious, and kind. We connected almost instantly, and after dating for a few years, we got married. My life felt like it was finally coming together. I had a stable job, a loving wife, and a plan for the future. But David was still struggling to find his way. He was constantly broke, unemployed, and always in some kind of trouble. Every time he hit rock bottom, our parents would bail him out, whether it was paying his rent, covering his bills, or letting him crash at their house for months at a time. They never seemed to hold him accountable for his mistakes, always saying, "He just needs more time," or, "He'll figure it out." Their unwavering support of David started to weigh on me. Here I was, working hard to build a stable life, while David was coasting by on their generosity. It was frustrating, but what could I do? He was their golden child, and I was used to being the responsible one. When David hit his early 30s, he had hit a new low. He had been fired from his latest job and was on the verge of eviction. Our parents, now in their 60s, were starting to feel the strain of supporting him. That's when they turned to me. "Ethan, we need you to help your brother," my mother said one evening over dinner. "He's really struggling, and we just can't afford to keep bailing him out." "Again?" I asked, exasperated. "He's had so many chances, Mom. When is he going to stand on his own 2 feet?" She gave me that pleading look she always used whenever she was asking me for a favor involving David. "He just needs a little more time. Maybe if he stayed with you and Jessica for a while, it would help him get back on his feet. He needs stability, and you've always been so good at providing that." I hesitated. Jessica had already expressed reservations about David staying with us before, But my parents kept pushing. They reminded me that he was family, that it was my duty to help him, that he'd never make it without me. Against my better judgment, I agreed to let David move in with us temporarily. I thought it would be just for a few weeks, maybe a couple of months at most. But that decision would set off a chain of events that would destroy everything I held dear. At first, things seemed to go smoothly. David moved into our guest room and made himself useful around the house, helping out with chores and running errands while he looked for a new job. Our parents were constantly checking in, calling me every few days to ask how he was doing. They were thrilled that I was helping him, and for a while, I convinced myself that things might actually turn out okay. But then I started noticing little things that made me uneasy. David and Jessica were spending more time together than I had expected, watching movies, going for walks, and sharing inside jokes. It wasn't overtly suspicious, but it was enough to make me uncomfortable. Jessica assured me that they were just bonding, and that she was trying to help him feel more at home. I wanted to believe her. But as the weeks went on, Jessica became more distant. She started working late more often, avoiding me when we were at home together, and her affection toward me faded. Our relationship, once so strong, started to crack under the strain. I tried to confront her about it, but every time I brought it up, she brushed me off, saying she was just tired or stressed from work. David, meanwhile, seemed to be thriving. He was in better spirits than I had seen in years, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't want to believe that my brother and my wife would betray me, but the nagging suspicion in the back of my mind wouldn't go away. Then, one evening, my world came crashing down. Jessica came home from work looking pale and anxious. She sat me down in the living room and took a deep breath, her hands trembling. "I have to tell you something," she said, her voice shaking. "I've been having an affair." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at her, unable to process what she had just said. "With who?" I asked, though deep down, I already knew the answer. "It's David," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "And I'm pregnant." I felt like the ground had opened up beneath me. My brother, the person I had spent my entire life supporting and defending, had not only betrayed me but had done so in the most unforgivable way. He had slept with my wife, and now they were going to have a child together. I didn't speak. I couldn't. The rage and heartbreak were too overwhelming. I packed a bag and walked out the door without saying another word. In the days that followed, I went numb. I moved into a small apartment across town and cut off all contact with Jessica and David. I ignored their calls, their texts, and even the messages from my parents, who were beside themselves with shock and anger. They had finally turned against David, disowning him for the first time in their lives. My mother, who had spent years coddling and protecting him, was devastated. "We never thought he would do something like this," she said during one of her many voicemails. "He's not our son anymore. You're the only family we have left, Ethan." But even that didn't bring me any solace. My parents' sudden loyalty felt hollow, too little too late. They had enabled David his entire life, and now, in the worst possible way, they were paying the price. And so was I. A few months after the fallout, tragedy struck again. My parents died in a car accident on their way to visit me. Their deaths were a crushing blow, but part of me had already grieved for them long before they passed. After their deaths were a crushing blow, but part of me had already grieved for them long before they passed. After learning about Jessica's affair with David, it felt like the family I had known was already gone. When I stood at the cemetery, watching their caskets being lowered into the ground, I couldn't help but feel a sense of loss for the parents they could have been, the parents I wish they were, ones who could have seen my worth earlier and treated David and me as equals. In the aftermath of their passing, I was named the sole heir to their estate. They had disowned David in their will, leaving me everything: their house, their savings, and $2 million in inheritance. It was an amount of money that could change anyone's life, but in those moments, I felt hollow. None of it could bring back what I had lost. David didn't show up at the funeral. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he had tried to contact me but ultimately decided against it, likely knowing I would have nothing to say to him. Jessica, too, was absent. The divorce papers had been signed just weeks before my parents' accident, making our split official. She was now out of my life for good, and the silence from her end was deafening. After the funeral, I began the arduous process of sorting through my parents' estate. Their home, filled with memories of my childhood, became a cold and empty place. I found old photographs of happier times, family vacations, birthday parties, moments when everything seemed perfect on the surface. But I couldn't escape the feeling that even then, the cracks were already forming. One day, while I was packing up their belongings, I came across a letter from my father that had been tucked into his desk drawer. It was addressed to me, dated only a week before the accident. Ethan. If you're reading this, then I'm no longer here. I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, about how we raised you and David, about the mistakes your mother and I made. I realize now that we weren't fair to you. We put too much pressure on you to take care of your brother, to be the responsible one, while we let David get away with far too much. We thought we were helping him by shielding him from the consequences of his actions, but in the end, we only made things worse. And in doing so, we failed you, too. We should have supported you more, appreciated you more. You were always the one who held everything together, and we took that for granted. I'm sorry, son. I hope that, somehow, you can find peace after everything that's happened. And I hope you can forgive us for the role we played in all of this. Love, Dad. I sat there in silence, the letter crumpled in my hand. It was the apology I had needed for so long, the acknowledgement of all the years I had spent sacrificing for my brother, only to be overlooked. But it came too late. My parents were gone, and nothing could change the past. Over the next few months, I slowly rebuilt my life. Therapy helped me process the anger, the grief, and the betrayal that had consumed me for so long. I sold my parents' house, invested the inheritance, and began focusing on myself for the first time in years. It wasn't easy, but I was learning to move on. That's when the final twist came. One day, out of the blue, I received a letter from David. It was the first time he had reached out since everything had fallen apart. At first, I debated throwing it away, not wanting to dredge up the past. But curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. Ethan. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to say it anyway. I'm sorry. I know that word probably means nothing to you now, but I don't know what else to say. I screwed up, worse than I ever have in my life, and I've lost everything because of it. I lost you, Mom and Dad, and Jessica. She left me, you know? She couldn't handle the guilt, and I don't blame her. I don't blame anyone but myself. I'm raising our child on my own now. He's about 6 months old, and every day I look at him and wonder what kind of man I'll become. I don't want him to grow up thinking I'm a failure, but I don't know how to be anything else. I know you hate me. I deserve that. But I'm asking you for one last favor, not for me, but for my son. He doesn't deserve to suffer because of my mistakes. I don't expect you to forgive me, but maybe, just maybe, you could be part of his life someday. He'll need someone to look up to, someone who isn't a screw-up like me. I understand if you never want to speak to me again. I just wanted you to know. David. I read the letter several times, my emotions swirling. Part of me wanted to tear it to shreds, to never think about David or the child he had with Jessica ever again. But another part of me, some deeply buried part, felt something else. Compassion, maybe. Pity. Perhaps even the faintest glimmer of hope. I wasn't ready to forgive David. Not yet. The wounds were still too fresh, too deep. But as much as I hated to admit it, his son was my nephew. The child was innocent in all of this, a living reminder of the past, yes, but also a symbol of the future. A future that didn't have to be defined by betrayal and loss. I didn't respond to David's letter right away. I needed time to think, to process everything. But the thought of that little boy, growing up without guidance, haunted me. I didn't want him to suffer for the sins of his father, just as I had suffered for the mistakes of mine. In the end, I did reach out, first cautiously, then more regularly. I met my nephew, a bright-eyed child with David's smile and Jessica's serious gaze. I could see both of them in him, but I also saw something new, something untainted by the pain of the past. He was a chance for a fresh start, for both me and David. I never fully reconciled with my brother. Some wounds don't heal completely, and our relationship would never be the same. But over time, we found a way to coexist, to at least be cordial for the sake of the child. As for me, I learned to let go of the bitterness that had consumed me for so long. My parents' legacy, David's betrayal, Jessica's infidelity, it would always be a part of my story, but it no longer defined me. In the end, I found peace. And in that peace, I found the strength to move forward, not because of my past, but in spite of it. My nephew, little Ethan, named after me, though David never directly acknowledged that, became a source of unexpected joy in my life. I watched him grow from a curious toddler into a spirited young boy, full of life and promise. He had no idea of the tangled history that preceded his birth, no understanding of the pain and betrayal that had nearly torn our family apart. To him, I was just Uncle Ethan, someone who showed up to his birthday parties, taught him how to ride a bike, and read him bedtime stories when David had to work late. As for David, he never fully regained the confidence that had once been his defining trait. He was humbled by the weight of his mistakes, but he was also trying, in his own flawed way, to be a better man, for his son, if not for himself. There were moments when I could see the old David resurface, flashes of the brother I had once known and loved, but they were fleeting. The affair, our parents' death, the complete collapse of everything he'd once relied on had left him broken in ways I couldn't fix. I'd be lying if I said we ever had a true reconciliation. Our relationship remained strained, marked by an unspoken agreement to never talk about the past. We saw each other often, for the sake of Ethan, but we kept things civil, never delving into the emotional depths of what had happened. I had no desire to reopen those wounds, and neither did he. Jessica, for her part, never reached out again after leaving David. I heard through mutual friends that she had moved to another city, trying to start fresh, free from the chaos she had helped create. I often wondered what kind of life she was living, but I never pursued it. That chapter of my life was closed, and I had no interest in reopening it. As the years passed, I became more like a father to my nephew than I had ever anticipated. David's work kept him busy, and though he was a loving parent, he wasn't always present. I filled that gap, not out of obligation but out of a genuine love for the boy. He brought something into my life that I hadn't even realized was missing, a sense of family that wasn't marred by resentment or competition, but built on unconditional love. The irony of it all wasn't lost on me. In some strange twist of fate, the child born from the worst betrayal of my life had become my salvation. He had no idea how much he was healing me, simply by existing, by loving me in that pure, untainted way that children do. Years later, when my nephew was about 10, we had a conversation that caught me off guard. We were sitting on the porch of my new home, one I had bought in the suburbs, far away from the memories of the city and my old life, watching the sun set. "Uncle Ethan," he said, his voice full of curiosity, "why don't you and Dad talk much? Like, really talk?" I paused, surprised by the question. Kids are more perceptive than we give them credit for, and Ethan had clearly picked up on the tension between me and his father. "Well," I began, carefully choosing my words, "your dad and I had some hard times when we were younger. We don't always agree on everything, and sometimes that makes it hard to talk about things." He frowned, his young mind trying to process the complexities of adult relationships. "But you still love him, right?" The question hit me harder than I expected. Did I still love David? After everything that had happened, after all the pain he had caused, did I still have room in my heart for that love? "I do," I said, after a moment. "I love him because he's my brother. And no matter what happens, family is family. Sometimes it's hard to love someone, but that doesn't mean you stop trying." Ethan seemed satisfied with that answer, nodding as he leaned against my shoulder. We sat there in silence for a while, watching the last light of the day fade away. As the years rolled on, I found that the anger and bitterness I had once clung to so tightly had slowly melted away. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges, and while I would never forget what David had done, I no longer carried it with me like a burden. I had let go of the need for vengeance, for retribution, and in doing so, I had freed myself from the past. I never remarried, and I didn't have any children of my own, but I didn't feel incomplete. My life was full, in its own way. I had my work, my friends, and most of all, I had Ethan. He became my legacy, the part of me that would carry on after I was gone. And that was enough. David and I never fully repaired our relationship, but we found a fragile peace. We weren't the brothers we once were, but we weren't enemies either. We were simply two men, bound by blood and shared history, trying to make the best of the lives we had left. On the day of Ethan's high school graduation, David and I stood side by side, watching him walk across the stage to receive his diploma. He had grown into a fine young man, smart, kind, and full of potential. As the crowd erupted into applause, David turned to me, his eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in years. "Gratitude. I couldn't have done this without you," he said quietly. I didn't respond right away. The truth was, I didn't need his gratitude. I had done what I had done not for him, but for Ethan, and for myself. Still, I appreciated the sentiment. "We did it for him," I said, nodding toward Ethan. "That's all that matters." For the first time in years, David smiled at me, and in that moment, I saw a glimpse of the brother I had once known. The pain, the betrayal, it would always be there, like a scar that never fully healed. But it no longer defined us. We stood there together, watching as our shared future, Ethan, walked into his own. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed these Reddit stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you never miss an update. See you in the next one.